There's a lot of lofty talk these days about creating shared value. The topic is perpetually featured in business and leadership journals and across a spectrum of conferences on social impact. There's broad agreement that this is the way forward, the right approach for business and for society at large. While the theory is well developed and rapidly gaining popularity, details on operational realities of shared value are lacking. There's no roadmap that lays out the steps to driving mutual benefit, no manual to govern the myriad and complex partnerships required to drive shared value. Our last conversation is being moderated online by Stanford Social Innovation Review. We hope you're following the conversation at #catalyze14. I'm here with Stan Litow, Vice President of Corporate Citizenship at IBM and President of the IBM Foundation. And once again, Deirdre White, CEO of Pyxera Global, for the last conversation of our broadcast today. Stan and Deirdre, let's talk about your experience with partnerships and how we chart a course forward. But first, Stan, I wanted you to share what we were just talking about, your key initiatives at IBM.
Well, I think the IBM Corporate Service Corps clearly is one. Some people refer to it as the corporate version of the Peace Corps, but it's what we would characterize as a program that provides triple benefit. We pick 500 of our top emerging leaders every year. So over the last 5-year period, 2,500 people who have gone on 850 team assignments in the developing world to solve a critical social problem on the ground. Creating a healthcare program in Nigeria, creating a program to train entrepreneurs in Turkey. All of the efforts are designed to pull together the best talent that we could find, put people on the ground for a month's period of time to come up with a significant solution. So that's the benefit to the people that you're serving. Mm-hmm. But the benefit to the people on the team is to completely upgrade their skills in cultural adaptability, teaming, listening, to be able to build a level of talent for the company that's really going to lead you into the future. And the final benefit is to the company. We use the Corporate Service Corps to be able to learn more about the growth markets than people could ever learn about on a business trip for a few days or a few weeks. And actually help you to make a market and learn a market.
Talk about self-interest. That's
sending people into the field. So it is really a triple benefit. So that's a good example of a shared value. I'm not so big fan of sharing value because I think it's most important to have real value because it's important to share something that's valuable. So Corporate Service Corps is one that I like a lot. The Smarter Cities Challenge, where we pick, over the last 3 years, 100 cities around the world that had a particularly challenging, difficult public policy problem. Building a transportation reform program in Nairobi, or coming up with a new economic development model in a city like Milwaukee in the United States, and sending in the best team that you could find to help public officials come up with that kind of challenge. And I guess the third one that I'd mention, and this is, at this point, a U.S. program. It's called P-TECH, and it's designed to reform high school in America by changing the model from a 9 through 12 high school to a grade 9 through 14 program, where you can really give young people an opportunity to have not just a high school diploma, but a guaranteed associate's degree and an agreement of being first in line for jobs when they complete a program like this. And that really is shared value, because you're talking about a value to the private sector in addressing the skills problem that we have in finding people with the skills to take 21st century jobs. The problem that education has, where right now in the United States only 25% of the students who register in a community college will complete.
That's right.
And the problem for young people in being able to not have a sustainable, effective future. So I think that's about real value. So is it easy to do that? Any of these programs? It's hard, and it does require partnership and collaboration. But if you look at the metrics about what you're trying to accomplish, you're trying to build real value for your company and trying to build real value for society.
It's interesting with the P-TECH program, which, by the way, the president mentioned in his speech, but that also is sort of implicit in that is that community colleges are failing and that you had to create a separate model. and that came out of the private sector.
Yeah, it came out of the private sector, but no private sector entity could solve that problem on their own. You had to find community college leadership who wanted to change, who were prepared to change. You had to find people in a K-12 system, and that's where I came from. I was deputy chancellor of schools for New York City. Educators want to improve, they need help to improve. So being able to come up with a model where people work together to incorporate workplace skills directly into a curriculum so that when you're learning math, you're also learning how to write, you're also learning how to present, you're learning how to solve problems, and do that in the context of a strong academic program. I'm not a big fan of throwing blame at systems that haven't been able to change. Change is tough, and you've got to walk into the opportunity for change and collaboration, understanding what your collaborator and partner needs to get out of this collaboration, what they bring to the table, and how you can collaborate and work together to produce a real, benefit that shares the benefit across sectors. To think that a company could solve a problem like improving public education in the United States operating on their own is as absurd as thinking you could solve the problem of the environment or healthcare or social safety net. These are problems that are very, very complex, and they require cross-sector solutions.
So the schools are based at K through 12 schools. I mean, you're using the existing system, and
you're using the existing system. You're not spending a nickel more than any other school. You're working within existing rules and regulations, but you're giving people a model that is really change-oriented. In the United States, people don't really remember this, but high school wasn't made mandatory until the end of the Second World War. Before that, every state said K to 8. Now, high school was an option. America made that change, and you could argue that it was critically important in fueling economic growth in the second half of the 20th century. And here we are in this 21st century, and the high school diploma isn't enough. Unless you are satisfied with maxing out at $12 an hour in a job that doesn't have a real future. So it requires...
Well, not only that, and you face a higher unemployment rate if you're a high school graduate versus a college graduate. Yeah.
Well, exactly. So, and we can sit back and say, well, we've got to improve our performance and get more kids to get a post-secondary education to hold these 14 million new jobs that are going to be created over the next 10 years, but they're going to go begging if we don't do something about the skills crisis, or you can roll up your sleeves and help solve this problem, because it's in everyone's interest to do that.
I want to get to Deirdre and then come back to you about scaling this up and with other partners. So while Pyxera Global as an NGO seems fairly unique in both the number and depth of its partnerships with the private sector, why do you consider this an important part of your work? And are there any special considerations regarding these partnerships given your NGO status?
It's been a really interesting journey. So most NGOs that work in our space are funded largely by the public sector. So they'll be funded by the bilateral, multilateral development institutions, for instance. And looking back 10 years ago, we were 100% funded by USAID. And we made a conscious decision and strategic decision as an organization for exactly some of the reasons that Stan just mentioned. The complex issues, the complex challenges that we look at across the globe, we don't think they can be resolved by one sector acting alone. And so we looked for the opportunities to leverage what we already knew in our experience over 15 years working around the world, but also looked for where we could leverage the private sector in particular to come to address some of these challenges. So we work with Stan and with IBM on the Corporate Service Corps program, and our job there is to go out into the communities to find the local organizations that are going to work with the IBMers over the course of a month to look at what their needs are and to develop the scopes of work and match the right people with those opportunities. And our ability to operate on the ground in so many different countries and our broad network of partnerships at a level that IBM doesn't have those partnerships has been critical in being able to build that program out. And we do similar programs to the Corporate Service Corps. We work with a lot of people you've seen on stage today. So with Dow, with Merck, with SAP, a dozen corporations that have programs that are loosely modeled, at least on the IBM Corporate Service Corps. But beyond that, we do quite a bit with corporations on localizing their supply chains. So there is a real opportunity to drive economic growth in many countries by looking at where are the opportunities for local businesses to build their own capacity to meet the very stringent requirements of a multinational buyer. And so our role there is to help to understand what the requirements are of the multinational buyer, translate those to a local context, and then work with the businesses on the different aspects of their operations that they need to upgrade in order to meet those requirements. And so like where there's creating value at all kinds of levels with the Corporate Service Corps program for an international oil company like Anadarko, they have a great interest in working with us because they see it's in their direct benefit to be able to procure goods and services locally over time. So that's their making their investment over the long term.
Give us some context. You're the one person here who sees all of these companies and what they're doing. Now, what are the numbers of, say, Fortune 1000 companies that have a vibrant, social engagement effort aimed at the developing world in particular, and how's that increased?
Well, I can tell you specifically about in the international corporate volunteer space or the global pro bono space, we know only of 39 companies that have a global pro bono program like the one that Stan described with the Corporate Service Corps. So only 39 companies. And yet you've heard from Stan and you've heard from all the companies that do this, that it's a huge triple benefit to the company. So why aren't there more companies doing it? Because the need is enormous and the opportunity is enormous. And so, when we see that there's just those 39 companies, that makes us say, okay, how can we get out there and spread this message? That's part of what this forum is about today. That's part of what our conference is, to get more companies to do this kind of work. In terms of other social engagement, actually, Stan may be a better person to answer that question because he sees this from the corporate side, I think, much more broadly in terms of the various kinds of programs that are going on.
Well, I think it's important not to call it voluntarism, and it's not to separate it out from your core business strategy. Because if it's something that you do with your excess cash and your excess time and something that's not critically important to you as a business, that's exactly how it's going to be treated, and that's how it's going to be delivered. I think it's important that this be directly connected to your core mission. And if you think about what companies are interested in, is the differentiators about talent. Do you have the talent to be competitive and to be successful? And if you're not using your citizenship programs to grow your talent, to build your talent, to improve retention of your top talent, to use as an attraction strategy to bring top talent, you're not going to have a program that's going to appeal to the business. If you're not going to be able to use your ability to work in markets to make markets and open markets and build your knowledge and understanding, to build relationships with government leaders, not-for-profit leaders, in a way that produces a benefit to the company. I think that if people are looking at citizenship as simply something that you do because it's a good thing to do or it's a generous thing to do, that's fine. But it sort of reminds me of when Rosabeth Kanter at the Harvard Business School looked at the IBM approach, and she said, it's going from spare change to real change. The spare change approach is that you have some small amount of benefit that you have and you want to share it with people. But if you look at building real change, you're not sharing the thing that's least important to you. You're sharing the thing that's most important to you because you're building value. You're building value for your shareholders, for your company in a way that is strategic, that is sustainable, and is scalable. You know, you asked the question of how do you bring these things to scale. I think one of the things that you learn is that the strategy around sustainability or scalability, don't save it for the end. When people think about an initiative and they build something new, and then they think it's going to survive and sustain itself because it's so great that people will want to see more of it. That may be working in the private sector all by yourself, where if you do a great successful restaurant, everybody will want to steal your recipes and want to learn how to compete against you. But sometimes in the private sector and sometimes in the public sector, and I've worked in all three, when you have an example of success, that's not an excuse, that's an excuse not to do more of it, as opposed to replicating
That void's
it.
already been filled.
Right.
Been there,
Saying,
done that.
well,
yeah.
you built this really great
Yeah.
school, but your school is on 32nd Street and we're on 22nd Street. And that doesn't have anything to do with me. So you want to build into your design of something new and innovative the sustainable and scalable strategy from the beginning, so that you can not only have one example of success, but build it into something larger. You know, we use the example of this corporate service corps. When we first launched it, our CEO said we were going to have 200 people a year over a 3-year period. It was so successful at the end of 8 months that we upped the number to 500 a year. So we weren't waiting to document the success. We were willing to build on it. And that's what innovation in the private sector is all about.
And what
I
about
think-
P-TECH? I'm sorry, how many students is that, and how are you?
We started in September of 2011 with one school. By September of 2014, there will be close to 30 schools, just in the United States, in Chicago, in New York City, across New York State, and in Connecticut. The president came up with a $100 million incentive plan to build out this initiative in more geographies. Many other governors are interested in it. And the reason is, number one, it doesn't cost more than any other school. Number two, it addresses the core problem of education and economic development, which is that we've got a skills crisis and we're not going to solve it unless we change the results of a system that right now where only 1 out of every 4 students who enrolls in a community college completes. So you've got to change that. And if you've got a model that does it and it doesn't cost more and it has the support of business and labor and it doesn't require an act of Congress or legislation to change it, it's sort of something that people could get behind.
Right.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the scalability issue, because I think one of the challenges that we all face in the scalability place, and one thing I didn't really hear explicitly said on this stage today, is that you can scale only as long as the partners are there to bring these things to scale. So I said 39 corporations are doing global pro bono programs. We want more corporations to do it. The corporate sector is moving at a much faster pace in terms of the evolution of their thinking and their action on how they are going to engage with the world and how they are going to take on this kind of programming. The people that are moving slower are the private sector and the NGO sector. And it has been, I think, a matter of great frustration, certainly for Pyxera Global as an organization, to see that there is still, I think, a huge level of discomfort with the idea that business may profit from doing good.
Interesting.
And it is not something that you hear said out loud too often, but you do see it in people's actions. And so you talked about spare change. Well, for the NGO world, for a lot of NGOs, it's a whole lot more comfortable to take your check, corporation. We're happy to take the money and go do a good program, but to hold your hand and walk down the street together and co-create something is very hard and very uncomfortable.
And probably, just to put this down on the ground, with people who have salary differentials, you know, somebody coming from an NGO versus somebody coming from a large company, you know, doing the same thing.
Well, I think if you have an opportunity to experience somebody who's coming in to dedicate their time and effort to solve your problem and walk out with a mentoring relationship, walk out with networks that will help you long after they've gone. You know, having been in the not-for-profit sector and having worked in government, to have that kind of access to problem-solving talent at a high level, you know, bring it on. I think that people really need to be receptive to that. And if it requires them, you know, to change a little bit to be able to accept that, that's why I said that you can't build a collaboration and partnership with a partner that you don't understand. And I think that there's a lot of difficulty in the sectors really looking at themselves and their problem individually and not understanding enough about the other sector. You know, when I was in government, a lot of people thought that the private sector was just another foundation, that they had money like other people had, and that's what they would give them. And the idea that they had research talent or marketing talent or communication skills, that you could get more out of this kind of collaboration and partnership. There are a lot of people in the private sector who think that government is ineffective and inefficient, and sometimes they are, but that's not where it ends, and that the not-for-profit is just good people who, you know, can't really improve by my skill and talent, you know, and it really is broader than that, and you really have to understand your partner and collaborator to give them the most and get the most in return. And that's what sets up these longer term, more effective collaboration and partnerships.
I think that's really important. I think that the understanding the other partner's goals, and the understanding and respecting the other partner's goals, and accepting the fact that you don't have to have the same goal. You can have parallel goals as long as they're not mutually exclusive. There's no reason why we can't be in partnership when IBM's goal is to develop leaders and to make a profit, and where my goal coming from the social sector is to improve lives and livelihoods around the world. We don't have the same end goal, but we certainly can partner so that we're both getting to those goals. And that's where some of the discomfort, I think, comes in when you talk about public sector and social sector partners.
Interesting. Well, thank you both very much. And thanks for being part of our broadcast today. We hope you'll continue to share your thoughts about today's event on Twitter and on Facebook at #Catalyze with a Z 14.